set up an Elite Eight game against Clemson. And that Elite Eight games against Clemson was going to be the biggest game in program history for one of the two teams. Both Alabama and Clemson, neither one has ever made a Final Four. So whoever wins that game makes their first ever Final Four. And if we talk about Grant Nelson being the most important guy, that you have to circle, obviously Ryland did great, but Grant, kind of stole the show against North Carolina. And we talked about how Mo Diabate really won the game for us against Grand Canyon. If you're going to talk about those guys, the guy who you have to circle outside of Mark Sears for this Clemson game has to be Jaron Stevenson. Much was talked about Jaron Stevenson in that Carolina game and the fact that he grew up outside of Chapel Hill. His mother played for Carolina. He grew up a Tar Heels fan. And it was going to be super emotional for him. And even though he didn't end up really scoring much in that Carolina game, he ends up actually not scoring at all. But Nate mentions that he leads the team in plus minus. He does end up getting 4 rebounds, an assist, a block. So he has an okay game in the 15 minutes he does get, but he doesn't end up scoring. So, that doesn't really surprise me. Obviously, he had a lot of pressure on himself, and I'm sure he had thought of that moment over and over and over again playing against Carolina. So that one didn't really surprise me. But in this Clemson game, we got the best version of Jaron Stevenson and what was his best game of his Alabama career thus far. Jaron ends up got the stat here. He ends up getting 19 points. He goes 2 of 3 from 2, 5 of 8 from 3, gets 3 rebounds and 2 blocks, and only one foul in 25 minutes of action. Right? So Jaron Stevenson, played absolutely to perfection. In the first half, the first shot he ends up putting up was an air ball. And I actually was sitting in the stadium closest to where that was. And you could tell it just felt like he kind of rushed it a little bit. But, it's like, hey, I hope this doesn't hurt his confidence. He had an open look. We thought that Clemson might give some open looks. Arizona had open looks and just had missed the shots. Clemson, for whatever, to their credit, their defense had not been super great at staying on shooters, but teams had not had great shooting luck against them thus far in the tournament. So Alabama opens the game pretty poorly from 3. And then Jaron Stevenson hits a big 3 when Alabama's down 13. And you can start to see that Alabama is starting to play a little bit more like we are used to seeing, right? In that game, Alabama gets down 13, but, I was texting with people during the game, and it never really felt like Clemson was just running away with the game. Alabama was crushing them on the offensive boards, and we were just missing some layups. We were missing some open shots. And not just open threes, but open layups or, pretty easy layups. And I actually heard in the press conference that Nate did, that he did after the game, that the analytics company that they use, I'm pretty sure it was HD Intelligence, but the analytics company that they had with them said that based on the stats of how the first half was played, they were analytically up like 11 points. The scoreboard said just 3, but that number of 11 that the analytics company said, in my mind made a lot of sense because Alabama felt like in complete control of the game. They were rebounding well. They were playing well on defense. They just were missing some shots. In the first half, the beginning of that game, it felt like Alabama came out pretty tight. It felt like Alabama was just rushing some shots and maybe was putting a little bit of pressure on themselves, knowing that this game was to go to the Final Four. We also saw some pretty weak fouls that went against Grant Nelson. A couple of them absolutely were fouls. A couple of them were a little questionable for how physical the game was being down low with PJ Hall and Nick Pringle and Grant. It just, a couple of them were a little weak, in my opinion, because of how physical they were allowing the game to get. But nevertheless, Grant Nelson picks up 2 fouls super early. And it seems like, hey, Alabama's playing really well, but if they lose Grant Nelson, Nick Pringle is going to have to step up. And as I mentioned just prior, he had a little bit of a sore foot. So we're not sure if that's going to come back to bite us. So obviously getting this game out of Jaron Stevenson is absolutely massive. Then as we get closer to half, Mark Sears starts making some shots. Riley Griffin makes a couple of shots. And everything just starts to turn in the position of, hey, Alabama's doing well in this game, and if they'll keep it up, they're going to go to the Final Four. And as a fan, it's hard to trust what you're seeing, because if you followed this basketball team for any number of years, there's been and it's been written, when good things happen, bad things are sure to follow. And it's kind of a situation where anytime you see we're doing well, you're kind of worried for the back-breaking turnover that's going to cost the game, or the terrible shot selection, or whatever it is that's going to end up costing them the game. You didn't really see it in this game. Alabama stuck to its guns, they stuck to their game plan, and they played what got them here. Alabama continues to get open shots from 3. After the really poor start to start the game, Alabama ends up shooting really, really well to end the game. They finish 16 of 36 from deep. Mark Sears, huge piece of that. I believe he went 0 of 7 to start and then was perfect to end, or 0 of 6, and then but he hit 7 in a row. Just massive shots from Mark Sears. One of them was a logo 3. In the defender. Defender doesn't step out. He takes it from the logo, nothing but net. Mark Sears really took over the game later on in the game as well. Obviously don't want to undercredit how well he played in this game, but getting the game that you got out of Jaron Stevenson was absolutely huge. The other guy you have to talk about when you talk about this Clemson game was Nick Pringle. In a game where Grant Nelson got into some foul trouble, Grant Nelson only ends up scoring 8 points. He does have 7 rebounds, but he has 4 turnovers and 4 fouls. Nick Pringle played one of the best games he's ever played, given the circumstances especially. He played 32 minutes. He gets 16 points, 11 rebounds, 5 assists, a block and a steal. And he goes 8 of 13 from the line. Much has been talked about Nick Pringle from the line. And I talked to the people around me, everybody was like, oh my gosh, Nick's at the line. The thing with Nick at the line is when he is in rhythm, he can make them. He has the form, even with the one-handed. When he gets it down, he can make shots. If you watch him in pregame warm-ups, if you watch him in halftime warm-ups, he can make shots. He'll make 10 in a row all the time. Sometimes he rushes it a little much or puts a little extra on it, as anybody might. And usually when he misses, he's missing a little deep and he's hitting it off the back iron. He ends up shooting pretty well in this game, and Alabama absolutely needed those free throws, because what was happening is, Alabama was answering a 3 for 3, 3 for 3, and then there was a moment where Clemson gets a 3, and we go to Nick down low. He gets an and one, finishes the and one for a 3-point play, right? So Alabama seemed to be taking every punch that Clemson threw at them, and it was perfect, right? The point when I personally knew, hey, this has a great chance of Alabama winning this game, is there was a sequence at around the 7-minute mark in this game. Joe Girard hits a 3 to cut the game to a 3-point game. Alabama, in like 5 seconds, pushes it down the court. Riley Griffin hits a 3 in the corner. The next possession, Joe Girard hits hits a contested 3. Alabama gets a 3 that possession for Jaron Stevenson to hit a 3. So Alabama's keeping it at that 6 point. Clemson cuts it to 3. Alabama gets it to 6. Clemson cuts it to 3. Alabama gets it to 6. And obviously, when this is happening, the pace is starting to rise a little bit. Alabama obviously wants to get that pace up. Then Ian Shefflin, the forward for Clemson, that's really not as much of a shooter, but absolutely can make shots, ends up missing a three, to which Alabama follows it up with a Mark Sears make, which stretches that lead to 9. Clemson has to take a timeout, and at that moment, it was pretty clear in my mind that Alabama had a great shot of winning this game because they were making Clemson play their game, not Clemson's game, right? Clemson's game is going into the post, playing through P.J. Hall, playing through Ian Shefflin. Their game is not running and gunning from threes and pushing it in transition. That's Alabama's game. So as soon as Clemson felt like, hey, we got to have Gerard hit a three, got to have Gerard hit a three, got to have Gerard hit a three. And he did. Gerard made 5 of 10 from deep. He was by far the best shooter they had on the court. But when the game turned into a three-point shooting contest, I'm going to take Alabama every time. Joe Girard has hit a lot of threes this season. I'm still going to take Alabama because Alabama has shooters on the court at every moment, and Alabama wins the game and makes its first ever Final Four. They win the game by 7 and make their first Final Four.